I'd like to welcome Ben McGarry from Future Energy from Aurecon. He'll be presenting today on the eligible equipment criteria. You'll hear from Ben about how the criteria was developed and the stakeholders involved, which has included state government, AEMO, South Australian Power Networks, the Clean Energy Council, and how they've drawn on their extensive experience and their key industry stakeholders. So welcome Ben to present. Thank you.
Morning all. It's nice to see some fresh faces this hour in the morning. I hope I can keep up with the energy levels of Sam. My name's Ben McGarry, I'm from Aurecon, and I'm pretty excited to be walking through some of the thinking that's led us to this point in the scheme. All of these slides, as Sam and Mel said, will be available later today. And so you'll see some of this content's meant to be read, not to be presented to. It's a little bit dense here, but if I could just walk you through some of the principles. What we've tried to do in the scheme is give the market the broadest latitude to deliver a range of potential solutions to installing a VPP capable system. That's because we recognise that there's a bunch of different configurations that could potentially be used, and we're trying to limit the constraints that we're putting on you in coming up with a system that complies with the scheme. So we've described the requirements as functional requirements, so it has to do A, B, C, D, E. It doesn't necessarily need to look like anything in particular. So we expect that it's going to be some combination of battery modules, inverters, sensors, controllers. But what we're really saying is it needs to do these things, and provided it does those things, you'll be able to get approval under the scheme. And I'll go through some of the configurations that we expect to see. And this isn't moving. That's because I'm using the laser pointer. Sorry if I've blinded anyone up there. So the website you've already seen describes a VPP capable system, and conceptually we just need this to, I guess, be more than a dumb system that just sits at the home and doesn't communicate with the outside world from a control and monitoring perspective. So we want it to be able to not necessarily be registered within a VPP, but be capable of being connected to a VPP in the future with a minimum of additional effort. Ideally, any additional effort is just a click of a button. So the next few slides walk through the eligibility criteria, and these have been developed pretty painstakingly with a bunch of stakeholders, as Melissa mentioned. They can come across as a little bit simplistic, but don't let that sort of give you the sense that they haven't been thought through, because what we've really tried to do is strike the balance between achieving high enough standards to ensure value for money for South Australians, while not making the standards too onerous or too much of a burden, and thereby limiting sort of the effectiveness of the scheme. So the first one's not even a requirement really, it's just highlighting that you can have AC or DC coupled systems. There needs to be a physical communications interface. So this is an Ethernet port. Again, this is a pretty trivial requirement, but we wanted it in there because it, in a way, it future-proofs a system. It means that in 5 years, as things evolve, presumably you can readily hook up a different controller or a different aggregation platform relatively simply. The third requirement, 1.3, is the ability to form a reliable internet connection, and that connection has to be accessible only by authorised parties. So this is really saying that it's got to be able to talk to the outside world. That doesn't need to be via the wired port. 1.4, remote registration. So it's got to be able to support registration of itself via an API to a remote service provider, and that might be the retailer, it might be the OEM's platform, it might be an aggregator, it might be someone that doesn't exist yet, but the system's got to be able to do that. And last one on this slide is remote monitoring. So we want to be able to poll the system and have it report its state at least at minutes of no greater than 5 minutes, at intervals of no greater than 5 minutes. So that's the battery state of charge, the real and reactive power, and then the voltage of the connection point. We wanted to distinguish that from the inverter voltage. So on the next page here, the requirements are about control and configuration. So as I said, we don't want this to be a dumb system that doesn't communicate with the world. It's got to be able to respond to remotely provided commands. It's got to be able to charge and discharge on command, and then perform the 3 mandatory demand response modes. So that's open circuit, don't import, and don't export. And for addition, where we're installing an entirely new system, we also want to be able to maintain the net output below or equal to export limits. So that's probably one that's probably a step beyond what many current systems do, but we know that many systems are capable of doing it, and that's going to become more and more important over the time. So remote configuration, you need to be able to update the firmware and change operational settings. Product performance and safety, so of course you're going to have to be 4777 compliant to connect to the network anyway. And then the batteries need to comply with the best practice guide, which you'll see was released June, July this year. It also needs to be listed on the CEC approved battery list, and you'll hear more about that later. So 1.9 is security. It's got to be protected against intrusion. And then lastly, the warranty requirements. So on the battery system or the battery modules, or the BESS if it's the same thing, we want a 7-year minimum warranty, and the remaining components and workmanship 5 years. So how do we assess whether a system's eligible? Sam mentioned, a seamless customer experience via the rate setter platform. We're also looking to make it easy for system providers to have their systems assessed. And Andrew from RateSetter is going to talk through that process via the platform. This looks like a challenge. It's not meant to be a challenge. All we're asking you to do is submit information that addresses those 10 criteria on the previous slides, and that will be via populating a form on the RateSetter platform that describes how the criteria is going to be met by your system, by your combination of components. We'll also give you the opportunity to upload data sheets or schematics to support that description. So the third bullet here says that as part of that application, we'll need to have you fully identify the main components. So we don't just want to see brand A inverter, brand B battery system. We're going to need to know the model numbers and the capacities. So as you guys know better than anyone, the way to meet the requirements will vary depending on a bunch of things, but one of them is, if you look to the left and the right, does solar already exist on the property when you go to do your sale or your install? And then if you look at the top two versus the bottom two, you've got a configuration that might have a hybrid inverter, or you might have separate inverters. And we expect, this is the way we've been thinking about the broad configurations. So I'm going to walk you through the first example, which is where you have a greenfield household, which is what we're calling one where you don't currently have solar installed, and you're looking to install a hybrid system. So you'll see that what we've added is the solar modules on the rooftop, a hybrid inverter, a battery system, a smart controller or meter, and then a current sensor. So if I flick back to the previous slide, you'll see that all that was there was the switchboard and the meter on the right. Then you're adding these components. And typically you expect a comms network between those components, but one of the points I'm going to be labouring is that it doesn't need to be this set of components. It can be any set of components that fulfills the requirements, and this is just one example. So from the scheme's perspective, the system is the combination of bits that you've sold and installed, or the system provider sold and installed to meet those requirements. So you'll see it excludes the modules, which have nothing to do with the requirements, but it includes the battery system, the inverter, and some other bits that we expect you'll require to fulfill the requirements. The second example, again, you're starting with a blank canvas. Here, you're installing separate inverters. So you install a solar inverter for the solar system, and then you have a BESS installed at the bottom. Here we've drawn it as an integrated BESS, but as you know, that could equally be a discrete battery inverter and a battery system. Everything else around this example is the same as the previous one. I won't go through all of these. The intent was to give this to you to take away, but these examples do show some of the principles. So here's an example where you already have a solar system on the property and you've got a legacy solar inverter. The customer and the system provider might between them agree to replace that solar inverter with a hybrid inverter. And that's what this example is. So you'll see that solar inverter gets pulled out and gets replaced with a new hybrid inverter, and everything else here is the same as the first example. So I won't go through this last example. It's similar to the second one. But I guess a key opportunity for the scheme is making use of systems where there's a battery-ready hybrid inverter on site. And this is, it's important that the scheme treats different systems equitably. So the scheme wanted to ensure that a customer who made use of their battery-ready hybrid inverter was not disadvantaged or advantaged relative to someone that's getting a fresh install. So to hold an installed system to the same standards, the system provider needs to warrant or make the same representations to the customer that that combination of components when it's installed, including that legacy installed hybrid inverter, will achieve the scheme requirements. And so the way to do that is that the final installed system needs to be identical to an approved offering under the scheme. So if you have an inverter installed that's 8 years, a solar inverter installed that's 8 years old, a hybrid inverter that's 8 years old, if that exists, that can only be made use of under the scheme if the system provider has that 8-year-old model of hybrid inverter approved as one of their complete eligible offerings. We expect for systems that have been installed relatively recently in the last couple of years, we expect that a system provider is likely to have that recently installed model as part of one of their approved offerings anyway. And so as you recall, the subsidy amount's calculated on the kilowatt hours, so whether the inverter is already installed or not doesn't change the subsidy amount. So I just wanted to walk through an example here. So if you assume you've got a SunTrax 5000.5 hypothetical hybrid inverter installed, the customer says, I want to make that the basis of a home battery scheme subsidised system. They have two options. They can either find a provider that already includes that model inverter as one of their offerings and say, sell me the rest of the bits of your offering, or they can find a provider that's willing to gain a new approval to incorporate that legacy component. But either way, the customer has the assurance that the installer knows how to make that installed inverter part of a compliance system that's VPP capable, and that's what's important for the scheme. So in this example, the approved offering that the system provider would have to have had approved is that SunTrax inverter and then the AGC brand battery system, the charge controller brand controller. So there's a lot of material here. What we expect is that you're going to take this away, digest it. Maybe you're digesting it as we speak, and you're welcome to ask questions for the panel later. We're really interested in seeing the creative approaches that you guys are going to bring to delivering schemes or delivering systems under the scheme. So thanks.